welcome to the Royal Institution and 2018 MHRA Annual Lecture. Thank you all for coming. This wonderful venue. You'll be interested to know that the lecture theatre was designed by an architect and geologist, Thomas Webster, in 1799. And the great seats were similar to those at Astley lecture theatres in British universities, so that you could see the body and all have a good view. So we thought it would be appropriate for Harpal to have something to display. So delighted to welcome Harpal to give this year's lecture. He started off at Cambridge doing chemical engineering, but soon went into healthcare, and in various roles he has been a key figure in the healthcare system in the UK, not least, of course, his as Chief Executive of Cancer Research UK, but he led the independent NHS Cancer Task Force, and he left in June, and he is now head of Johnson & Johnson Innovation in Europe, Middle East and Africa. He'll be speaking about medical innovation, and we'll be very interested to hear what he has, and his talk will be followed by a panel discussion with 4 members of the corporate executive team, and that will be chaired by Ian Hudson, the Chief Executive. We are filming the lecture, so that if you want to see yourself answer difficult questions, you're quite at liberty to do so. It'll be up and running sometime next week. But in the meantime, Harpal, very well.
Well, I'm just very pleased they didn't play Dancing Queen as I was coming up to the podium here. Colleagues, distinguished guests, good evening. My thank you for the kind introduction. It really is an honour to be asked to give this lecture today. I know I stand on the shoulders of some very great giants who've given this lecture before me, and it's a privilege to be asked to do so. Preparing for this has given me a chance to reflect on nearly 16 years at Cancer Research UK. For those of you who are less familiar, the second largest cancer research organisation globally after the US government. And I've enjoyed the opportunity to pull together some of what I learned working with researchers, clinicians, patients, regulators like the MHRA, the NHS and the government. And I should say up front that everything I'm going to be talking about this evening are my personal reflections following my time at Cancer Research UK rather than anything to do with my new role at Johnson & Johnson. Now, I always felt it was a huge privilege leading Cancer Research UK for so long. Every week our pioneering scientists and clinicians would come up with a new development, a new piece of knowledge that slotted into or sometimes fundamentally changed our understanding of how to tackle this disease. And it was inspiring and stimulating to be so close to that every day. As I'll come on to, we've made huge progress. And I'm clear that research has been at the heart of that progress, but the title of this talk tonight asks the question whether the system is keeping pace. And so I'll be talking rather less about what's exciting in the global research endeavour and rather more about where we are in the UK right now. But I'm happy to take questions on some of the research excitement later on. So in the context of our system, the NHS, there's one message I'd particularly like to leave you with tonight, which is that we have the potential to transform outcomes for many thousands of cancer patients based on what we know now, even if there were no more research. So my message is that we could and we should be doing a lot better than we are. So I'm going to focus on 3 key themes today. First, I fundamentally believe that we have to see a paradigm shift. The NHS needs to pivot around much earlier detection, diagnosis and interception of disease rather than the current paradigm, which is that we have a secondary and tertiary-led approach to cancer with a majority of resources spent on treating patients with advanced disease and relatively little focus on the opportunities in primary care and public health. Second, that we need to tackle the unacceptable variation that exists in access to treatment. The NHS needs to work much harder to ensure that evidence-based interventions and clinical pathways are available to all patients throughout the country. And third, and with a nod to our hosts, that the models we use for clinical research and how it interfaces with the NHS have to evolve and get smarter. Now, one of the great joys of working in the cancer arena over the last 2 decades has been actually that we know or have been able to determine a great deal of what's going on. The richness of data we have on cancer is unique, and it's a phenomenal strength of the UK. And I make sure that we make use of that data. The power of the analyses we were able to undertake has been significant. It's underpinned the cancer strategies that we've had, and it's enabled a real focus on those areas that offer the greatest potential for transformation. So before I get into the 3 themes, let's just first take a look at where we are, a state of the nation, if you like. So for anyone born since 1960, which of course is the majority of the population, the lifetime risk of being diagnosed with cancer is now north of 1 in 2, and still rising. This continuing increase is largely because of our ageing population. But lest we rest on our laurels, our lifestyle-associated risk is also increasing. And while we've made huge progress in tackling tobacco, we have a long way to go in addressing the burden of preventable disease. So we really can't celebrate success until we see age-standardized incidence starting to fall, and we don't look like achieving that anytime soon. The growth and ageing of our population means that we're likely to see an increase in the total number of deaths from cancer in the UK over the next decade or so. Nearly 162,000 deaths per year at the last count, representing 28% of all deaths in the UK. The good news is that we've made huge progress. In the early 1970s, fewer than 1 in 4 patients survived cancer diagnosis long term. By the early part of this decade, that had doubled to 1 in 2. And it was a profoundly important milestone, and probably the proudest moment of my time at Cancer Research UK, because it meant for the first time in history, definitively, that cancer wasn't a death sentence. I could say that more people were now surviving cancer than dying from it. And I could talk about the transformation that has happened in my lifetime. A child diagnosed with cancer in the early 70s had around a 20% chance of surviving. Now that's north of 80%. Massive change. Change that has been driven by a combination of research advances and a big shift in the organisation and deployment of NHS resources. Moreover, we could see that the pace of progress was accelerating, which is why I publicly set the ambition, despite a lot of resistance, but very much built on expectation, that we should make as much progress in the next 20 years as we had in the last 40. In other words, that by 2034, 3 in 4 people should be surviving cancer long term. So how do I feel about that now? Well, I see no reason to be less optimistic today than I was 4 years ago when I set out that ambition, that we will have the knowledge and tools to do so. Whether the UK system will be primed to deliver these outcomes remains to be seen. But as an example, we recently reported that breast cancer mortality in the UK has fallen by 10% in just 5 years. So we can and we are making huge progress. Now, of course, that progress hasn't been uniform. Cancer is many different diseases, at least 200 types. The different types have different causes, etiologies, metastatic profiles, and treatment approaches. We've seen huge variation in outcomes and in the scale of progress across different types of cancer. In lung, brain, pancreas, and esophageal cancers, for example, survival still remains pitifully low. So, if we made all this progress, why is it that it doesn't feel so great? Well, one reason is the huge numbers that I've already touched on. The other is that we know, and the media rightly regularly reports, that we don't do as well as our international comparators. We're improving, but so is everyone else. And the data shows quite clearly that other than in breast cancer, we're not closing the gap. Now, we've known about this international survival deficit since at least 2000. And the fact that we haven't made more progress in closing it 18 years later, in my view, is a scandal. Our 5-year survival for lung cancer of 13% is a long way from Canada's 21%. For colon and rectal cancers, around 60%, compared to Australia's 70%. For stomach, 21%, compared to 32% in Australia. You get the picture. My crude estimate is that if we had the same survival as countries like Australia, which has a broadly similar health system and spends broadly the same proportion of GDP on health as we do, we would see around 23,000 more people surviving cancer every year, avoiding roughly 14% of all deaths from cancer. That's a tremendous prize. So one of the things that we set out to achieve at Cancer Research UK was to understand why our outcomes were so poor. Frankly, there were a number of clinicians who refused to believe it. We proved that it was real. Patients wanted to know why, but they weren't getting the answers they needed from the NHS or from their doctors. So I was clear that it was our responsibility to help find the answers. And when we drill down, it becomes clear that the biggest single contributor to our poor relative performance is that, on average, patients in the UK are diagnosed with more advanced disease than we see in these other countries. But what's also clear when we drill down is that these are our averages. There's enormous variation across the country in access, in stage of diagnosis, and therefore in outcomes. And finally, cancer is a massive burning platform, because as the population ages, the sheer numbers and the consequent burden on NHS resources are going to grow massively. We're predicting a 40 to 45% increase in the incidence of cancer over the next 20 years. We bent the curve in HIV, we need to do so in cancer. Okay, so that's where we are, that's the stock check if you like. Let me move on to my first main theme, which I've already alluded to, the imperative for earlier diagnosis and interception. I've already described the huge increased burden of cancer on the NHS as we move forward. If we continue with a paradigm of largely focusing on secondary and tertiary care and spending NHS resources on late-stage disease, this burden will become unsustainable. So I'm clear that we have to pivot. We have to think and act differently. As many of you will know, a colon cancer patient diagnosed at late stage has less than 10% chance of surviving with current treatment. A patient diagnosed at early stage has greater than a 90% chance of surviving. Now, each cancer patient will typically interface with multiple parts of the NHS during their diagnosis and treatment. Too many of them have stories about delays in going to their GP with symptoms, delays in getting a referral from their GP, being pushed around the health system to get a diagnosis, often with little or no communication from one appointment to the next, or from one part of the health system to the next. Almost every patient I spoke to during the development of the cancer strategy in 2015 talked about turning up to a second, third or fourth appointment and having to start again. The oncologist wouldn't have access to their test results, so they would have to order another scan or book another outpatient appointment. It all adds up to delays and cost. And delays matter. Some patients with aggressive lung tumours can move from stage 1B to stage 3 in as little as 6 weeks, with a dramatic change in survival outlook. In some parts of the country, you can't even get an X-ray read in 6 weeks. If we cracked earlier diagnosis, it wouldn't just enable us to catch up with our international counterparts through the thousands of lives saved. It would also mean a huge increase in NHS efficiency. The total cost of treating a patient diagnosed with late-stage colon cancer is around 3 to 4 times the total cost of treating a colon cancer patient diagnosed at early stage. And by the way, reorienting the system to intercept disease early would benefit patients with many other conditions beyond cancer. I remember when Sir Mike Richards was the National Cancer Director, we used to talk about how to get late diagnosis of cancer onto the agenda. And we agreed that one of the things that would be really useful to understand was for him to ask his counterparts, the other national directors of different diseases, whether they thought late diagnosis was a problem in their conditions of interest. And resoundingly they said yes, and that diagnosing earlier would make a significant difference to outcomes. It's just that we have better comparative data on outcomes in cancer than in other disease areas, and therefore, arguably, we could make a more compelling case. As time has passed, we've learned more about the opportunities and value in being able to diagnose earlier type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, pulmonary hypertension, and undoubtedly many other conditions. So what do we need to do? First, do better what we already know. And secondly, we need to develop new ways of detecting and intercepting earlier. In terms of doing better what we already know, there are a number of things that require concerted effort. We need to shift behaviour so that when a member of the public has worrying symptoms, they act promptly. Many of us, including me, hypothesised that our awareness of cancer symptoms was worse than in other countries, or we were too fatalistic to do anything about it if we did have symptoms. In fact, our awareness of signs and symptoms and our attitudes towards cancer in the UK are no worse than in other countries. But we have a uniquely British perception that seeing the doctor with symptoms might be a waste of the doctor's time. And plus, it's hard to get an appointment. So I'll just put it off, and eventually months go by. We need to optimise screening, incorporating new tests much faster than we currently do and offering them at the appropriate ages, bowel cancer being the case in point. And on this screening note, I'm hugely encouraged by the latest data presented a couple of weeks ago in a conference abstract from the Nelson's trial showing a substantial reduction in lung cancer mortality with low-dose CT. Currently, 59% of lung cancer patients are diagnosed at stage 3B or 4, the most advanced stages when there's very little we can do to achieve a long-term survival. When the Nelson results are published in full, if they're as promising as they appear, we need to move swiftly to implement. And on this one, I congratulate NHS England on already planning some pilots for how we might implement lung screening so that we maximise efficiency and access. Beyond screening, we need to streamline and optimise our diagnostic pathways. That's to say, once a patient does present to their GP with symptoms, the path from there needs to be as rapid and efficient as possible. It isn't at the moment, not least because we have woefully under-resourced diagnostic services in radiology, in pathology, and in endoscopy. We have less than half the trained radiologists per capita that Germany has. More than 1 in 10 of our diagnostic posts is vacant across the country. There is no doubt in my mind that this diagnostic capacity deficit will be the biggest barrier to making progress in the UK in the next 10 years. Something that the NHS is stubbornly reluctant to hear is that we need to test more, we need to investigate more, if we're to catch more cancers early. But because we have huge capacity constraints, GPs are forced into playing a gatekeeping role. And this culture compounds the worry that patients have about wasting their doctor's time. We've had new NICE guidelines for cancer investigation for some years, which lower the threshold of suspicion before referring for a test. But just because we have national policy doesn't mean things change. The new guidelines are still not rolled out, there's low awareness in GP practices, and referral forms haven't been updated. And because of the lack of diagnostic capacity, commissioners push back, because they don't want to see continued failure against performance targets. And so the result is we see late diagnosis and huge variation. We see a 10-fold variation in age-standardised chest X-ray rates by GP practice across the country. Around a 10% differential in the proportion of cancers diagnosed at late stage across the country. If we could level up the proportion of cancers diagnosed early, roughly speaking, we could halve our international survival deficit, between 10 and 15,000 lives per year, just by eliminating variation. But of course, that only takes us so far. We also need new technologies, new diagnostic tests, new screening tests, and new diagnostic pathways. I've touched already on my excitement about the potential for lung screening. In the coming years, we need to be much more disruptive. I'm confident that we'll see new tests emerge, liquid biopsies, volatile compounds, better imaging, who knows what else might come along. We need a platform that enables us to evaluate these new approaches to prove whether or not they make a difference to mortality. These are long and expensive studies, beyond the capacity of most small companies and academic labs, and they require new business models. It requires a new way of thinking in the NHS, a true embracing of the potential for the NHS to be a population research laboratory, embedding research at its heart so that it truly becomes a learning organisation. It's not too long before we'll be able to use machine learning and AI to help alleviate the desperate shortages in radiology and pathology, although that doesn't mean we won't still need more staff. Some of the latest studies show that we're beginning to see the same level of performance from these AI approaches as trained experts, at least for the majority of cases that are less complex. We'll be able to understand better who is genetically at greater susceptibility for different cancers and monitor them more closely. For those who are at significantly greater risk, we might be able to intercept early to stop full-blown cancer. Many cancers have inflammatory precursors that offer the potential for this kind of interception. Pulmonary fibrosis in lung cancer, adenomas in colon cancer, Barrett's in esophageal cancer. We'll have better markers for each of these conditions, which enable us both to detect them early and determine which ones need treating. And we'll have new devices and drugs to do so. For example, in harnessing the immune system to keep cancers under control. So we can paint a vision of an era when we can keep some cancers at bay by intercepting early and detect many others at a much earlier stage when they're curable. All of this as an alternative to treating late-stage disease. Of course, this will present an interesting conundrum to all those large pharmaceutical companies whose efforts to date have focused on treating metastatic disease. And it will also present a challenge to regulators, particularly if we're intercepting early to stop aggressive disease before the patient has symptoms, as we necessarily shift the risk-benefit equation, more of which later. And we should also ask whether we should put more control in the hands of the public. For example, one could envisage a patient-facing app that assesses the presence and mix of certain symptoms. One could envisage a scenario where, above a certain threshold, there could be an automatic referral of the patient to a diagnostic centre, or indeed targeted prevention advice if they're below that threshold. As I've said, the prize is huge if we focus on earlier detection and interception, so we have to go for it. The second theme I want to talk about is tackling the unacceptable variation in access to treatment that exists around the country beyond earlier diagnosis. I said earlier that the biggest contributor to our relative international survival deficit was late diagnosis. The second biggest contributor is access to treatment, particularly for people with more advanced disease. Now, in all my time at Cancer Research UK, the role of NICE and access to cancer medicines was hitting the headlines. We frequently felt that that critique was unfair. NICE has a very difficult job to do, with limited resources and with parameters that are set from without. It's a tough ask, but actually in the last couple of years, notwithstanding the growing challenge of the cost of new cancer drugs, we've seen a steady stream of NICE positive appraisals. Of course, they don't always get it right, and even when they do, they often take too long to get there. Sometimes this is because of iterative negotiations with the drug companies. And my new employers would probably add that NICE could do with updating and being more flexible with some of its evaluation methodology. But my overriding reflection and experience is that ultimately, really good new drugs eventually do find a way to reach patients in the UK. In my view, what's actually of greater concern, and where we should place much greater focus, is whether innovation is fully rolled out to all who would benefit once national decisions have been made. I've talked frequently about the fact that if you're a patient treated at one of the best centres in the UK, the Marsden, the Christie, UCLH, you'll receive treatment that is state-of-the-art, and your chances of doing well are as good as anywhere in the world. The problem arises when you're one of the majority of patients who don't have access to that state-of-the-art. Uptake of novel drugs is an obvious area for improvement, but let me give you 3 non-drug examples. This is a picture of lung resection rates across the country. Even if you exclude the real outliers, we have a roughly 2-fold variation. We know that radical treatment in lung cancer leads to much better outcomes. So this picture is a disgrace, but it used to be even worse. Professor McPeak, a lung cancer clinician who did most of his work in Leicester and now largely in London, identified this some years back. He and his colleagues started publishing this data and annually monitoring progress. The great news is that Mick and his colleagues have started to drive some real change. The variation used to be 6-fold. So what we've seen is a doubling of resection rates over the last 10 years, and as a result, we're seeing lung cancer outcomes improve. But why were we there in the first place? And as I've shown, significant variation remains. And it isn't restricted to surgery. We also see a huge variation in rates of chemoradiation with stage 3 lung cancer patients. A second example, intensity modulated radiotherapy. Developed here in the UK, with much of the most significant clinical research being carried out here, funded by MHRA and Cancer Research UK. And yet we're still not at the recommended proportion of at least 50% of patients having access to IMRT for curative treatment. It was appallingly low 7 or 8 years ago, but with a concerted push by Cancer Research UK and the Department of Health, we're now up at around 44%. But look at the bottom of the slide, look at the variation. Across CCGs, a variation of 23% to 69%. And a final example, access to molecular diagnostics to guide treatment. There's strong evidence that only patients with a particular molecular aberration should get access to certain cancer drugs. Now this is a pretty complicated chart, but suffice to say, around half of patients are not getting access to these molecular diagnostic tests, meaning that thousands of cancer patients each year are missing out on drug treatments that might benefit them. Now the answer isn't that we need to centralise everything and have all clinical decisions run from Skipton House. But we do need to get better at identifying variation and acting on it. We need to more fully embrace the value of clinically driven optimal pathways in supporting the rollout of best practice across the country. Having identified the problem, there has been action in all 3 of the examples I've just shown you, but there are countless others. So why do we have such extreme variation? Well, it's undoubtedly a combination of several factors. Clinical conservatism in some places. Also an inability to keep up with the sheer pace of progress. Some of the most challenging conversations I've had over the last few years was when I spoke with doctors in remote but nevertheless very busy general hospitals. If you are the lone oncologist at a DGH trying to treat patients with every type of cancer, how can you possibly be up to date with all of the amazing clinical advances we've seen in the last few years? How can you do the best for your patients? Most secondary care clinicians place huge reliance on clinical guidelines, but a substantial proportion of them feel that they're not updated frequently enough, especially when it comes to NICE guidelines. Not surprisingly, it's also about money. And for some reason, it seems to be worse in cancer than in other disease areas. A recent survey of secondary care clinicians by Cancer Research UK showed that around 60% of doctors felt that they'd experienced a barrier to adopting a new treatment. But this rose to 83% amongst oncologists, with money being the most frequent barrier cited. So either oncologists are the most vociferous whingers, or there really is a problem. I think it's probably the latter. Now clearly there are perverse incentives in some places, either around tariffs or around provider mentality, or simply around resource. But as I've said, quality data is what we need to expose variation. And then, as I've said, we can address it. Okay, so the final theme I'd like to talk about is the future of cancer clinical research. And I want to be clear that I believe that the randomized controlled trial remains the gold standard for determining whether a new intervention is superior to current standard of care. But we are in the most fascinating and fast-paced era for clinical developments in cancer. And these developments are posing significant questions to the conduct of clinical research and the way in which we bring new treatments to market. So I'm going to call out 4 of these questions. There are others, but I'm going to call out 4 of them. First, we're getting ever more sophisticated in our understanding of disease stratification. We're beginning to identify the molecular basis of different patient subsets and understand why these different subsets respond so differently to new or indeed conventional treatments. Even in an area like glioma, we now know there are around 20 different subtypes, which almost certainly need different treatment approaches. But this means we either have a very small number of eligible patients for any particular clinical study in order to show a strong signal, or we dilute that signal by not stratifying. So how are we to achieve statistical significance in an area like glioma where we have massive unmet need? We know that histology doesn't sufficiently discriminate between the different subtypes, and clearly neither does a single mutation test like EGFR. The risk of getting this wrong, as we are surely doing, is that we end up over-treating some patients who won't benefit, and equally as concerning, we end up killing therapies which may actually work. Secondly, we now know much more about how certain tumours rapidly evolve, how genomically unstable they are, and how heterogeneous they are. For optimal treatment, this implies repeated molecular classification. But we can't subject patients to repeated tumour biopsies, particularly in organs like the lung or brain. So how do we conduct research when the tumours are outpacing our ability to monitor them clinically is a huge challenge. I've seen early data from a study in Germany suggesting that 50% of brain cancers diagnosed as medulloblastomas are glioblastomas at relapse. But because we don't rebiopsy, we're guessing as to what to do, which means that conclusions from our clinical studies may not be as definitive or as informative as we may think. Clearly, liquid biopsies offer one potential solution, and they need to be developed and validated at pace. One area of promise is that if we could reliably ascertain the presence of minimal residual disease, for example through a liquid biopsy, we could massively reduce the cost and timelines of adjuvant trials and treat only those at real risk of recurrence. My third question relates to the increasing understanding we have of the dynamic nature of tumour evolution and therapy. Right now, we hope that a new therapy will elicit a positive response, and we test for that. We don't particularly design clinical studies with a view to understanding how a therapy might drive tumour evolution as well as response. For example, there's emerging evidence that in different patients, some therapies may suppress an immune response, whilst in others, the therapy might enhance it. We see suggestions that some treatments can be mutagenic. I've seen data from one patient in whom there were 4 mutations in the exome identified at the primary diagnosis, but more than 6,000 at relapse. So what's going on? Is this treatment independent or treatment driven evolution? Some scientists are hypothesizing that therapies can cause treatment stabilization temporarily, but then push tumours into a much more aggressive, genomically unstable state. So how should we design clinical studies to address this question? And the final question is one I've already alluded to. If the pace of progress in a particular type of cancer is so fast that the standard of care evolves during the course of a clinical study, then what is the standard of care? And how do we determine efficacy? So I would suggest that what we need to do is to evolve from what is largely a binary decision-making paradigm to a continuum that starts with a clinical study and evolves to routine access, with different sets of evidence playing in at different points. A continuum that accepts initial immature data, particularly in areas of significant unmet need, but which evolves in line with the maturing of that data, either in clinical trials or ideally through real-world evidence. Maybe in some conditions, like gliomas, we should contemplate foregoing phase 3 studies if we see a strong enough signal in phase 2 and can design a stringent phase 4 approach to licensing. Maybe we could contemplate an evolutionary approach to reimbursement as evidence of value emerges in the real world. Of course, these concepts would change the nature of phase 3 and phase 4 studies. The technology appraisal and reimbursement mechanisms might need to flex to cope with less mature data and move much more towards a managed access mode, as we're now trialling with the Cancer Drugs Fund, but making much more use of real-world evidence. At the moment, areas of focus around real-world evidence largely are on being able to demonstrate value. But can we focus on using real-world evidence much more for efficacy? It would require upgrading of data standards and integrity, but the NHS could be the best place in the world to do this kind of work. Now, none of these are easy challenges, and I don't pretend to have the answers, but we have to move forward quickly so that our system can deliver at pace and at scale. The NHS and NIHR need to consider how to support a future of cancer research studies where absolute number of participants are not the driver. Instead, it may be about smaller and more stratified, or platform, or adaptive studies, possibly run from a smaller number of centres. And if we move in that direction, we'll need to consider how best to ensure that the right people and patients who are being treated in DGHs are linked into those studies. It's been a pleasure for me to work closely with the MHRA over the last 15 years or so. I've been impressed with its willingness to be at the vanguard of regulatory innovation in Europe, something that truly benefits us here in the UK. But as I stand here delivering this MHRA Annual Lecture, my provocation is that regulators like the MHRA will need to be able to flex even further in the future to address the challenges I've posed, so that clinical researchers are able to expedite the development of the most transformative interventions to bring them to patients faster. And technology appraisals also need to be able to cope with this flex. Before I wrap up, just a word or two about involving patients in our work. Although I've talked a lot about the value of data, for successful programs of research, successful policy interventions, high quality information provision, and the successful uptake of innovation in the NHS, the involvement of patients is absolutely vital. We went on quite a journey regarding patient involvement at Cancer Research UK during my time there. When you talk to patients, as I've done many, many times over the last 16 years, where you get to very quickly, unsurprisingly, is that they want the best possible outcomes. They want as much quality time with their loved ones as possible. At its worst, patient involvement can simply be a tick box exercise. At its best, it can represent co-production that significantly enhances the impact of an initiative. I saw this firsthand many times, whether in the development of the NHS Cancer Strategy in 2015, in providing a human face to our policy and campaigning work, or in the direct involvement in our research decision-making, such as embedding patients in our funding committees. For example, it was extraordinary to see how patients enhanced the quality and precision of the questions that are now being addressed in the Cancer Research UK's grants challenges, such as how we distinguish between lethal cancers that need treating and non-lethal ones that can be left alone, and how we deal with the associated patient perspectives and ethical considerations. For Cancer Research UK, patient involvement has become a way of doing business, and I would encourage others to do likewise. It isn't easy, but it really is worth it. Advances in cancer treatment are no longer the sole purview of researchers. Patients and their doctors have much greater access to knowledge of new treatments. It's right that they have this knowledge, but the consequence is an unprecedented demand for access to these advances. It's not wrong when a patient or their loved one is desperate to try something when they've otherwise run out of options and there isn't a clinical trial they can go on. So we're seeing an increasing pressure to change the framework. And I'm reminded of several conversations I had with my friend Dame Tessa Jowell in this regard. And as the BMJ recently reported, others are using crowdfunding to raise thousands of pounds to access treatments that otherwise aren't available on the NHS and might often be unproven. these pressures are only likely to increase. I'm clear that it's absolutely right that patients and the public expect and demand improvements and rapid access to advances in healthcare. So it's up to all of us to design and evolve a system that's able to respond, that maintains those checks and balances so that patient safety remains at the heart of all we do, but that offers more flexibility to accelerate our progress. And so to wrap up, it's clear to all of us that our NHS has been struggling. When I consider the pressure that the NHS has been under, I think it's amazing that we've seen the progress we have. And actually cancer is a shining example. And that's testament to the outstanding dedication and determination of those delivering care up and down the country. I feel we lost a bit of momentum in cancer after the 2012 and 2013 health reforms dismantled much of the national cancer support infrastructure and networks that we had. Gradually that infrastructure is being rebuilt, but it takes time. And accountability for driving improvement at a local level remains fuzzy. For me, pace is key. As I said at the beginning, I'm confident that we'll have the knowledge and tools to transform our outcomes by the 2030s. But will our system have kept up? Pace is key from the perspective of every individual patient, living with the uncertainty and anxiety of whether their symptoms mean cancer, and the knowledge that if they do, every day of delay makes their prognosis worse. The new funding settlement, an extra 20 billion by 2023, is of course welcome, as is the renewed ambition from the Prime Minister on early diagnosis of cancer. But most of the expert commentators, I expect most of the people in this room, including me, think that 20 billion won't be enough to move us into another gear. At best, it will enable us to stand still, given the increasing demand from a growing and ageing population. Our analysis at Cancer Research UK showed that we need to double our rate of progress in the UK if we're to meet the ambitions set out in the cancer strategy, let alone the bolder ambition that the Prime Minister set out just a couple of weeks ago. So we have to be smart. We have to use our resources wisely. Our vibrant research community in the UK needs to optimise and play to its strengths and find new opportunities for partnerships. We need to get better at rolling out advances that are proven and at discontinuing approaches that are less effective. We need to invest in approaches that work in our NHS. We need to pivot from treating late stage to diagnosing, intercepting and treating early. We need to tackle unacceptable variation. And we need to innovate and develop new models which help bring new transformative advances to patients faster. And in doing so, it is perfectly within our grasp to see 3 in 4 patients surviving cancer long term by 2034. So let's make sure we do it, because the patients are waiting. Thank you very much.
Harpal, thank you so much for such an excellent and inspiring lecture this evening. It's been absolutely fantastic. Your 3 themes of moving much more into prevention and early diagnosis, tackling the variation in healthcare, and also ensuring that research evolves are so very important.
Well, we've been privileged to hear a gem of a lecture, Harpal, thank you so much. And not least because almost everything you've touched on is critical to the work of the future of the MHRA. And as we had in the sort of the talk, real evidence to AI and so on and so forth, these things are going to be critical in the future. Not least of which, different ways of doing clinical studies. And I've been talking heavily to the colleagues in licensing about basket trials, umbrella trials, things like that, about the greater, more use of Bayesian statistics and so on. So, Harpal, thank you so very much. And something to remember us by for you. Take home and don't let the kids spoil it. Thank you.